Hello and welcome to episode 18 of What's Tom Reading. I'm Tom and today I'm talking about the political thriller Red Notice by Bill Browder. This book was an incredible look into the world of high finance and corruption in post-Soviet era Russia. It had Wall Street billionaires, Russian gangster oligarchs, and some stunning information about the world's most powerful man. I loved this book and I think you'll love it too. Stay tuned and enjoy the show. All right, so as I said, today we are talking about the book Red Notice, a true story of high finance, murder, and one man's fight for justice by Bill Browder. This book gives a lot of credence to the idea that sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. There were stories in this book that I honestly could hardly believe, and the author's intention is to shine a light on all of the hideous corruption and atrocities that are still going on inside of modern Russia to this day. So, we're going to jump in and talk about that. First, just a quick update. Thank you guys so much for listening to the show. Really appreciate it. I'm feeling a lot better now, a lot more healthy. And so let's get on with it. Let's get back to this cranking these out and getting a good pattern. It's been a little while since I've been able to get, a good flow going with these, but I feel really, really good about this. And I've got a few more books that I'm ready to start cranking out episodes on. So let's take a minute to talk about the author of this book, Red Notice. So Bill Browder was born into a family of communists. And I mean that literally. His grandfather was the head of the Communist Party in the United States. And the way that came about was that he was the head of a labor union in Kansas. And the Soviets said to him, wow, you're really good at that, labor union. So how'd you like to come over here and learn about communism? And the Grandpa Browder flew over to Russia, where I'm assuming they put a tarp over the mountain of corpses that were rotting in the sun, so as not to spook their guests. He fell in love with a Russian woman there and got busy learning about all of the wonders of communism. Eventually, he brought his Russian bride back to the United States, and they set into work running the Communist Party of the United States. He actually ran on the presidential ticket against Roosevelt back in the 1940s and didn't win. Basically, when he returned to the United States, he hit the ground running, spreading the good word far and wide and agitating for collectivism and famine to anybody who would listen. Browder's parents were both college professors and also communists, which is another thing that seems to often go hand in hand. As the old saying goes, those who can't do teach, and those who can't teach infiltrate Western temples of thought to topple them from within on behalf of totalitarian dictators across the world. Maybe the original saying flowed off the tongue a little bit better than that. But anyways, Bill's brother decided to follow in the footsteps of his, family tradition. And he threw his lot in with, the communist ideology. But Bill knew from an early age that he was different. He was always kind of the black sheep of the family. And he preferred to, make things instead of tear things down. And kind of as an interesting way to rebel against his family, he decided to do the one thing that would bother them the most. He put on a suit and a tie and he went to become a capitalist. And naturally, his family disowned him. His father told him, "No son of mine is going to generate surplus value with his labor and contribute to a fair and free market. You'll take off that suit and become a fat maggot feasting on the rotting carcass of a collapsed communal system like the rest of us, or you'll get out of my house." So, disowned, young Bill struck out into the world, paid his dues, and worked his way into Stanford Business School, where he got an MBA with an emphasis on being a Stanford Business School graduate. So nobody cares what, if anything, you studied. Basically, if you went to Stanford Business School, you can do whatever you want. It's a good business school. But anyways, after graduation, he went to work for Boston Consulting Group, BCG, where he worked his way into being the head of a non-existent Eastern European investment sector. His graduation coincided perfectly with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent privatization of the once communally owned, read here, actually just owned by the dictator, but, on paper, communally owned, publicly owned industries. And the way that the old Soviet bloc countries tried to privatize things was actually a sort of unique strategy. They had what's basically they call it a voucher system. Excuse me. And what they did was they divided the entire Russian economy up, or, the Ukrainian economy, or whatever country, Polish economy, whatever countries were coming out of, after the Iron Curtain fell, after the Soviet Union fell, these countries all divided up their economies into equal shares among all of the citizens, all of the adult citizens of their countries, and just say, okay, here's our entire economy. Everyone gets a voucher that's worth 60 millionth of the economy, or 1/20 millionth of the economy, right? Depending on the country that you're in. And you could take these vouchers, and the idea was that you would trade them in for ownership in your share of the now privatized economy. But giving all these vouchers out to just like a group of peasants who had been, laboring under communist dictatorship and, tyranny for generations, they didn't really know what to do with the vouchers. And so pretty quickly they were like, these vouchers developed a paper value kind of in the market of about like $8 to $12, which is crazy. It's actually insane that the valuation of those vouchers was so low. And you had people trading them for like, a couple of rashers of bacon or like a bottle of vodka, right? And some enterprising Russians who caught kind of the privatization bug, the capitalist bug that, was going around, they would start to pool these vouchers into like bigger heaps of vouchers. They'd trade with their neighbors so they could get a fistful of vouchers, and then they'd sell, bundles of them. And these bundles got bigger and bigger and bigger until, you had people who were trading serious quantities of the Russian economy in the form of these vouchers. And so they take them to these public auctions where you'd use your vouchers to bid on shares of once publicly held companies. And this concept was a total crapshoot. So if there were lots of bidders, you'd use up a bunch of your vouchers on a really small portion of a company. And if there were just a few bidders, you could end up with a huge share of an entire industry for just a handful of these vouchers. Total crapshoot, total random. Basically, it was just a fire sale of everything that was once owned by the communist dictatorships to get it into the hands of private citizens. Basically, they were giving it away for free. And naturally, and this I think is fair, right? The Russians weren't super fond of the idea of foreign investors coming in and owning chunks of Russian industry. And so they started to engage in all sorts of shenanigans to keep people from being able to attend the auctions for businesses that they were interested in keeping for themselves. They'd block off the road with a pile of tires and light it on fire, during the auction so that people couldn't get there, or that they'd close down an airport so that people couldn't fly into the area where the auction was being, held. And in that way, the powerful kind of Russian gangsters that kind of rose up to fill the power vacuum, they were able to kind of cordon off their own sections of the economy using the vouchers that they had gathered. And one thing that's worth noting here, that I think was just incredible, almost beggars belief, the entire Russian economy during this era of privatization was valued at just $10 billion, which is just unbelievably small. For context, that's about 40 times smaller than just the company Walmart. Just for reference, for a country that has so much access to natural resources, oil, natural gas, minerals, lumber, all steel. I mean, this country is huge population, vast territory. That valuation, $10 billion, it's a joke. And it just goes to show how quickly all of the value in the system can be destroyed by, communism. And, I'm glad that the world has learned its lesson and nobody's dumb enough to advocate for socialism or communism anymore, right? Aren't you? Aren't you glad? Anyways, back to the story. The Russians started engaging in some very interesting legal shenanigans as they quickly spawned their own generation of blood-sucking lawyers and a corrupt court system to serve as their vehicle to power. These lawyers, under the direction of the gangsters who secretly owned everything after the reshuffle, did some fancy pants corporate restructuring in order to hide the ball from foreign investors and the less savvy Russian citizen investors as well. And one of the ways that they did this is, when your vouchers came in for a company at an auction, you would get what's called common stock in the company. And I'm going to go just a little bit of corporate structuring for you here. Just this is kind of my specialty. So they would get common stock, which would be their ownership percentage of the company. But secretly, during this restructuring, during the privatization, these companies would build into their operating agreements what's called preferred shares, and they distribute these to the employees as well as the real behind the scenes owners. And these preferred shares would be given a preferential dividend that was to be paid before the common shares, and that dividend would absorb all of the profits of the company. So effectively, the common shares would never ever get paid anything for their ownership portion. So you could own, a decent percentage of, a Russian oil and gas company, but you would never get paid anything if you had common shares, only if you had preferred shares. And you could get those preferred shares basically only if you were an employee or if you kind of had an in on the operating agreement in some way, which these gangsters and lawyers did. What's interesting, though, about, our protagonist of the story, Bill Browder, is that he's actually very familiar with corporate structuring, and he's able to kind of exploit the model that they've built by going directly to the workers and buying the shares from them. So he's able to get a good chunk of these profitable shares from a lot of different companies just through his networking and his kind of scheming. And basically, cutting to the meat of the story, I'm skipping over a lot of Mr. Browder's story here. With all the people that he met and how he got his career off the ground and all that stuff, it's very, very interesting. But I wanted to spend the bulk of my time talking about the crazy stuff that happened with the Russians. So basically, the power vacuum that existed right after the fall of the Soviet Union kind of spawned like a bunch of super powerful gangster oligarchs, and they started to sweep up all the vouchers, strong arm their way into owning just majority share of these entire industries. And they use extremely corrupt new Russian legal hocus pocus to siphon off the wealth of these companies and defraud all of the minority interests in their companies, including like the vast majority of the Russian public. And Browder was running his own investment firm in Russia at this point. It's called the Hermitage Fund. And he was one of the minority investors that was being taken for a ride and defrauded here. And he spent a lot of money buying a chunk of this undervalued Russian economy. And then you see his investments rise dramatically as the industry start to take off and the true valuation of the Russian economy starts to kind of take hold. As they shake off the inefficiencies of communism and get to these are huge industries, right? In a huge country. And so they're worth obviously way, way, way more than $10 billion. And so he gets a huge return initially, but then he sees his investments start to fall again as the companies, for like just crazy, bewildering reasons, suddenly stop making money. And basically the gangsters were using their control over the companies to gift themselves and their buddies all of the lucrative assets of the companies for pennies on the dollar. And they'd hide these assets in companies that they alone owned, like shell companies hidden all around Russia and outside of Russia and in the West and, Canary Islands and all the stuff that, corrupt rich people tend to do with their assets. And they would leave the shareholders holding shares of a useless husk of a company, common shares that didn't even pay dividends, of a company that was basically defunct. And so Bill Browder hated this. He was starting to lose money over it. And he decided that the Russians had kind of messed with the wrong guy here. And he was, was going to stand up for his investors and stand up for his company. So he started playing hardball. And his strategy was to use his own network of resources to gather information on all the frauds that the gangsters had been perpetuating, compile them into like a sexy report, maybe with a cool video or something, and deliver it to the international media. And Russians were an interesting people at this time and are an interesting people to this day, right? They are their own culture for sure. And remember that they're shaking off decades of rule under a hideously tyrannical regime. And now they're becoming conscious of their rights and the rights of their neighbors in some very unique ways. And they're holding on tight to these rights. But that said, some of the old vestiges of the inform on your family culture of Soviet Russia, no loyalties except for party loyalties kind of thing, have stuck around. And so the author at this point, Browder, tells a Russian joke that kind of encapsulates some of the cultural vibe that's going on over there at this time. And so it goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a man who was walking down the road in his village. And when he stumbled upon a magical fish that was flopping around in the dirt, he picked up the fish and took it over to the stream and dropped it in. And the fish, grateful, said to him, "Thank you so much for your kindness. I will grant you one wish, anything your heart desires. I'm a magical fish." And so the man's thinking, "Oh, wow, that's pretty great. What should I get? Should I get, a mountain of gold? Should I get an army? Should I get, 100 servants? Should I get 400 cows? What's my heart's desire?" And as he's sitting there mulling it over, the fish says, "But there's one catch. Anything I give you, your neighbor gets double." And the Russian responds, "Put out one of my eyes." And that's kind of what the author says is sort of the joke. These Russians, they'd rather see their neighbor go down than get benefit themselves. And here's another joke that I had heard elsewhere, but they kind of had the same sort of vibe about Russians during this time. And so a man dies. He's a bad man. So he dies and he goes to hell, and the devil's showing him around, and they come to a pit that's surrounded by guards, and there's, weeping and screaming and, all sorts of horrible sounds coming from the pit. And the man walks over and looks down the ledge, and he sees a bunch of people crawling out, and then the guards, poking them down with sharp stakes and poking them back down into the pit. And The man says, "What is this?" And the devil says, "This is American hell. This is where we keep the Americans. They always try to climb out of the pit, and so we've got to poke them back down again." And the man says, "Oh, well, my, that's horrible." They walk over to another pit. It has fewer guards. And the man says, "Well, what is this?" And he says, "This is British hell. There's a lot of people that are still trying to climb out, but a lot of them are, resigned to their fate there. Their stiff upper lip keeps them down in the pit. They accept their punishment. So we don't need as many guards." Then they come to another pit and there's no guards. The man says, "What's this?" And he says, "This is Russian hell." And the man says, "Well, where are all the guards?" He says, "We don't need any guards. Whenever one tries to climb out of the pit, the others pull them back down." See, kind of an interesting take on Russian culture. So back to the story. I hope those jokes were entertaining. You can imagine with that culture how the Russian people felt when they found out that their fellow Russians, these gangsters, were pulling a heist on them. They were pissed, to say the least. There was widespread outrage and calls for justice. And the new president, Vladimir Putin, who you may know as the current president, Vladimir Putin, at that time, he was still trying to consolidate his power. And this is the late 90s here. And so he was quick to make moves against the gangsters that had been outed. And in this way, Browder protected his investments, and he made a ton of enemies among the Russian gangster class. But for some reason, he wasn't afraid of being murdered, even though, as he said in his book, people get killed in Russia for much less than that. His theory is that the gangsters all thought that he was secretly working for Putin, since every gangster that he and his company would expose would get taken down by Putin's government almost like right away, like clockwork. So in a weird way, he ended up being kind of partners with Putin, and he was untouchable, at least for a little while. And that went on for some time, and he made some money and had a good time feeling like a white knight, saving, the Russian people from the corruption of these gangsters, and also making money hand over fist for himself and his partners. But anyways, Putin, during this time, he consolidates his power, and the good times change in 2003 when Putin, he makes this big move and he solidifies his rule once and for all. And like to this day, right? So he arrests the richest man in Russia, who's this gangster who owned just a massive Russian oil company, and he stuffs him in a cage on national television and conducts just a show trial in which the man was charged as an enemy of the state. And the trial was displayed, like I said, on international television, and the message was very clear. You don't mess with Putin. He will get you no matter how rich and how powerful you are. So naturally, the gangsters, the rest of the oligarchs who were less rich and less powerful, they were cowed, right? And they came to Putin one by one and said, "Dear glorious Obersturmführer Putin, my master, my king, please do not put me in a cage. I will do anything you ask." To which the strongman Putin allegedly responded, 50%. And, this is just kind of the rumor on the street. There's, this hasn't been confirmed. This is the allegation. This is what, the oligarchs have said behind closed doors, supposedly. But this is 50% of all of their ill-gotten haul, not to be given to, the Russian people or to be used in the administration of the Russian state, but for Putin himself. And naturally, with all of this off-the-books power and wealth, Vladimir Putin is almost certainly the richest, most powerful man on earth, if not on paper, then in actual reality, right? If he has this type of control over these industries and this type of personal leverage and wealth, I mean, holy crap, right? So he's the dictator for life of a very powerful country, and he's like the kingpin of all the gangsters that are pillaging the cream of the Russian economy. That's not really a bad place to be power-wise, right? Like, he's a very powerful dude. Now, Browder's efforts to expose corruption, he keeps them going, but now suddenly they're working against Putin's interests. After all, now that Putin's a kingpin, he doesn't want some, dirty, rotten American kicking up dust in the international community about all of this ill-gotten loot that he's now taking 50% of. So suddenly Browder finds himself very, very high up on Putin's personal enemy list. And a little while later, while he's trying to fly into Russia, he gets stopped at the airport, detained overnight while the authorities refuse to say a word to him. They stonewall him. They don't feed him or give him anything to drink, and they just kind of stare at him. It's a big power play, huge power move. And they deport him without a word, stuff him onto a flight back to the United Kingdom, and declare him an enemy of the state. His visa's revoked. His assets in Russia are kind of exposed to the Russian authorities' predations. But ever the crafty fella, Browder is able to subtly liquidate, through his contacts back at his business in Russia. He liquidates all of his Russian assets, gets the money out of country, and evacuates his non-Russian staff. And he just shutters the business. So it's empty. It's all shut down. And right after that, the Russian authorities throw a raid on the now empty companies. They beat the crap out of a couple of staff members, and then they steal all of the stamps, seals, and signed documents. And then they use the stamps, seals, and signatures to forge documents that put them in debt to the Russian government for tax evasion. They signed the companies over to a convicted murderer, who then says, "Oh, I'm selling these companies. I'm going in default." They hire a bogus lawyer to represent the companies, and then they go to court and plead guilty to all sorts of charges on behalf of these companies without Browder or any of the actual officers of the company being involved. A total farce, total kangaroo court. But the Russian judiciary system isn't exactly known for being like a robust house of justice. So that all just went fine for them, for the conspirators. And pretty quickly, the Russian authorities, they send Browder and friends a tax bill that was for the precise amount of what the assets that they used to hold were worth. Crazy coincidence, right? And this is obviously an attempt to ruin Browder, seize all of his assets, and bankrupt his firm. But Browder was one step ahead of the Russians here, and they couldn't find the assets because they'd already been liquidated. Too slow, I guess, but that didn't stop them from labeling Browder an enemy of the Russian people and putting him on trial in absentia. No habeas corpus rules in Russia, after all. And then they put out a red notice for Interpol, which is like the highest, notice for an international fugitive, so that Browder will be arrested at any port of entry and extradited to Russia to face Russian justice for his crimes. And what is Russian justice, you ask? Well, we'll get to that very soon. So when Browder hears what the Russian police had done in fraudulently seizing his company, he decides to hire a talented Russian lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei Magnitsky. Man, I'm not great with Russian names. You'll have to bear with me. So he hires Magnitsky to investigate what's going on here. And Magnitsky finds that the scheme has two parts. So first, they tried to seize all the assets of the Hermitage Fund, and that part failed. Second, and very sneakily, they applied for a tax refund on behalf of the Hermitage Fund for $230 million, which is the previous year's taxes in their entirety. And then they give themselves this tax return after a day, right? And transfer it to themselves, steal it, and then they frame Browder and Magnitsky for doing that. And it's a huge fraud against the Russian people, $250 million, and the conspirators put the cash directly into their own pockets. Now, thinking that there's no way that Putin would have greenlit such a theft, Browder decided to do what he's best at. He went to the international press and exposed the corrupt scheme, hoping that the good guys would get the bad guys. And as he says, there are no good guys in Putin's Russia. Magnitsky went and testified to the Russian version of the FBI and every authority they could get an audience for, and he gave sworn statements left, right, and center. And a couple of weeks after this PR stunt, those same officers that Magnitsky had implicated in this scheme, they show up to his house, they arrest him, take him to a dank cell where they start to administer some of that Russian justice we were talking about. Basically, well, not to put too fine of a point on it, they tortured him. They tortured him in order to get him to take back his testimony and confess, quote unquote, that he and Browder were really the ones behind the scheme. So they kept him in a cell with no toilet, no window panes, and no heat. And this is in December in Moscow, by the way, so he just nearly freezes to death. They keep him awake 24/7, imposing sleep deprivation on him. They beat him regularly. And if there's one thing that the Russians have a long history of being pretty good at, it's torturing their own citizens into making false confessions so that they can be disposed of in a way that's convenient, right? Obviously, Magnitsky's aware of what happens to people who confess. They have a short show trial followed by a short walk into a, small room. And then after that, it's directly to the crematorium. So, something along the lines of put up against a wall, shot in the head and cremated, or sent to be worked to death in a Siberian gulag. That's basically what he kind of expected. So he refuses to break under the torture. And he says he would not perjure himself, as an officer of the court. He's a lawyer, right? And that means something to him. And he also would not bear false witness as a Christian. That means something to him too. And you got to admire the guts of this guy to hold out under such crazy circumstances, but hold out he did, and for a long time. And after 6 months of this horrific treatment, Sergei Magnitsky's health begins to deteriorate. He loses a ton of weight, develops chronic stomach pains caused by gallstones and pancreatitis, and his condition just gets worse and worse. And his captors are thrilled at this development because withholding medical care becomes this trump card for them, and it's this cripplingly painful ailment, and it's its own brand of encouragement for him to cooperate. But he still holds out. He still refuses to perjure himself and to confess to this crime because I think he knows what happens to him if he does confess, right? And so they dangle his confession in front of him in exchange for critical medical care, and he refuses. So they keep him away from the hospital until his health completely fails and he goes into critical condition. And at that point, they decide to transfer him to a prison medical facility on one night. And he thinks that they're finally going to give him the medical treatment that he so badly needs. But it turns out they were just covering their tracks. They just wanted to make it look like they were actually sending him to get medical treatment. But the night that he gets there, they chain him to a bed and 8 Russian prison guards dressed in riot gear burst into a room and beat him to death with rubber batons. And they documented it. They filled out the paperwork and said, we're going to go in there with rubber batons and beat this guy up. And he died. Later on, when his mother comes to check on him at the hospital, she's informed that he passed away on the operating table due to complications related to his condition. That's obviously a lie. She's suspicious of this, and so she fights to be able to see her son's body. And I don't know the specific details about this, but the author refers to Russian Orthodox Christians having very particular set of burial rites that they want to adhere to, or that they adhere to for religious reasons. Like I said, I don't know. But the grieving Mama Magnitsky is eventually able to speak to a soft-hearted coroner who lets her sneak in to perform last rites for her son before the state cremates him and hides the evidence. When she sees his body, she's just stunned at how badly brutalized he is. He's got ligature marks from where they chained him to the bed on his wrists, and bruises all over his body. His face is badly beaten, basically borderline unrecognizable. And she knows that her son met an agonizing and unnatural end at the hands of his captors. But, she's an old lady in Russia. And so, she knows that he crossed the wrong people. And that's what happens in Russia when you cross the wrong people, right? She must have grown up during the Soviet era and been well aware of what happens to people who step out of line. So during the aftermath of this whole thing, the Russian authorities, they really circle the wagons. They get their story straight. They cover up their crime, because right now they're trying to, get some respect on the world stage. They can't just, do the whole, NKVD, KGB, gulag, killing people thing, right? So Putin personally pardons everyone who's complicit in the scheme, and he even gives some state honors to some of the conspirators. And I think it's maybe safe to assume that some of that $230 million might have made it into the big guy's pocket at the end of the day. But Browder decides that he's going to try and hit Putin and his cronies where it hurts. So yes, they had stolen the money in Russia, but they hide that money in the West. And he decided to put together a campaign and lobby the United States Congress to pass a law that would condemn people who engaged in, these types of frauds, murders, torturing, crimes against humanities, and the like, right? And long story short, he picks up some traction for it. He meets the right people. He gets into the right rooms. He gets a Democrat and a Republican senator on board, and they draft together a law that's called the Magnitsky Act. And it essentially just will freeze the assets of these Russians who are involved and complicit in the scheme, and it cancels their visa, and it renders them basically unable to partake in their ill-gotten gains at all. It's not exactly, justice for murder, but it is a good start, and it does hit them where it hurts, right? Like right in the pocketbook. And this bill receives tremendously broad bipartisan support from both Democrats and Republicans. They view it as basically a no-brainer. Well, they did view it as a no-brainer until the presidential debate between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. During that debate, Romney was asked what he thought was the biggest threat to U.S. security in the world right now, and he said that Russia's predations and corruption represent the most salient threat to our interests. Obama responded, quippily, the 1980s called and they want their foreign policy back, which, was super cute. And the audience laughed a lot, and they were like, oh, get roasted, Romney. Cutesy schoolyard way for Obama to score some points during a debate. But unfortunately, as a result, it meant that the Magnitsky bill suddenly became political baggage for Democrats in Congress who didn't want to be seen passing a piece of legislation that pointed out just how dangerous Russia was on the international stage. After all, the 1980s called, they want their foreign policy back. All of a sudden, that bill that everybody loved and thought was a no-brainer starts puttering along on fumes, and the Democrats circle the wagons during an election year, just like, they always do. Does this make them a hive of cowardly scumbags? Yes, it does. Are the Republicans any better? No, not really. I can see them doing the exact same thing if the shoe was on the other foot, right? Just another thing to love about American politics, right? A schoolyard, I know you are, but what am I quip during a debate, and all of a sudden a bill holding people accountable for crimes against humanity isn't politically expedient anymore. Politics is tedious, but, at least we aren't Russia, right? And if you're wondering about the timeline here, that's the craziest part for me. Magnitsky was tortured to death in a Russian prison in 2009. That's modern day Russia. And I need to note here, actually, after Obama handily secures the presidential election in 2012, the Democrats, they do kind of sneak back into the chambers and honor the commitments that they had made. The Magnitsky Act passes by wide margins, bipartisan support, and just a couple of weeks after the election. Very little fanfare, though. But at least they got it done at the end of the day. It could have been a good moment of bipartisan unity against, the evils and corruptions of the world. But, party comes before honor every time. And I'm sure Congress has matured since then and would never devolve to partisan showmanship now, right? Anyway, enough. You didn't come here for that. So back to the Russians. Naturally, they were irate about having their assets frozen, and Browder was happy to get some small amount of justice for his friend Magnitsky. But to this day, Browder spends all of his time working hard to be a thorn in Vladimir Putin's butt, for example, by writing books like this one. I'm going to wrap that up for things that I like. I want to move on to some other things, but I got to tell you guys, I loved this book. I thought that the storytelling was excellent. I thought that the timeline was really engaging. I really liked hearing about his own personal rise into, how he got into his own position, the people that he met, the deals that he made. There's a good amount of that up front. And as a person who's interested in business, and business deals, I really liked that he included those details. And then once he got into like the full Russian scandal like that was almost too crazy to believe some of those stories. And in fact, it is too crazy for me to believe all of those stories. And I'll get to that, in the second half of the book. But I loved so much about this book. Very interesting, very entertaining, very crazy. And that's it for the things that I liked. Let's move on to the corners. Let's go to the science corner first. All right, welcome to the Science Corner. And today, since we're talking about Russia and science, I thought it would be a great opportunity to take a field trip to Chernobyl, which, technically is in Ukraine, but it was during, the Soviet era. So I feel like that kind of counts as Russia a little bit. Well, maybe it doesn't, but we're talking about Soviets, so Ukraine, whatever. Anyways, in 1986, in the nuclear reactor in Chernobyl, there's this giant steam explosion. It's very complicated circumstances, but long story short, a big explosion that causes an open air graphite fire, I guess. It just explodes and then casts just radiation from the reactor all over the place. Basically, during this one incident, 400 times the radiation released by the atom bomb at Hiroshima gets released just into the atmosphere and starts to blow around, the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian countryside. And I realized I'd never said Belarusian out loud. I don't know if that's how the pronunciation, but yeah, it's all over Belarus, basically. Hundreds of billions of dollars of damage in this radiation that's everywhere. And it kills lots and lots of people. And the radiation is so severe that you can't really be in it for longer than a couple of minutes, without it giving you a fatal dose. And a bunch of firefighters rush in and lots of them get killed. A bunch of people, are really trying to get this situation under control. Eventually, the Soviet Union sends 600,000 workers into the heart of this radiation to build what's called the sarcophagus. It's this giant metal and concrete structure that covers the entire melted down reactor core area. And it was the most dangerous place in the world to be. Definitely. If you were to go inside the sarcophagus right now, today, the radiation would kill you in about 3 minutes. Now, over the years, this sarcophagus, it was hastily built naturally, right? Because they wanted to get out of there. And a lot of people died building that. But over the years, this hastily built structure has started to collapse, which is risking a leak of even more deadly radiation into the world. And so the Ukrainian government, they devoted 2% of their national GDP in 2017, I believe, just in 1 year, to build this giant metal kind of dome tent thing, and then they roll it over the entire superstructure of the sarcophagus. And hopefully this will last a long time to keep that radiation contained. There are people, that are working on the site. If you're standing on top of the sarcophagus directly on the roof, you can be there for 3 minutes and then you get your maximum dose of radiation and they got to send you out of there. Right. But there's all these people who are working on it and they have to, come in, work for just a little while and then get out because, you can't be exposed to too much radiation at once, but they're trying to clean up this area. An estimated 4,000 people have died as a direct result of the accident. And that's a low estimate. Some experts argue that more than 90,000 people have died of cancers that they wouldn't have gotten if it hadn't been for the incident. And it will still be likely it'll still likely be several hundred years before Chernobyl is safe for humans to live in again, which is just wild. The damage that's been done here, it's got to be the worst man-made disaster in the history of humanity. It's got to be, right? I mean, there's the Fukushima nuclear reactor in Japan that had a meltdown as well that did a ton of damage, and I think that's technically the number one right now in terms of actual like dollar cost. But no one's ever done like a real dollar breakdown of Chernobyl. I mean, the Belarusian countryside is still irradiated. The Ukrainian countryside in some parts and the Russian countryside in some parts is still irradiated from this incident. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people exposed to huge levels of radiation, lots of cancer, the fallout for this is just unbelievable. And what's crazy to me is that there are currently 194 people who live in Chernobyl right now for some reason. And that doesn't include, the thousands of workers who travel in for a stint of cleanup, before being rotated out before their radiation exposure goes too high, right? And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that these 194 irradiated human beings who are living there are actually zombies. And that is where the zombie apocalypse is going to start from. But that remains to be seen as of this recording. This has been the Science Corner. Let's go over to the History Corner. Welcome to the History Corner, friends. Today, we're going to take a trip down memory lane and learn a little bit about the wonders of communism. Now, I've known a lot of people in my undergraduate education, particularly, who are quick to say things like, real communism has never been tried, and that's not real communism, when you point to the 100 million dead human beings that communism has left in its wake. Let's explore that. Today, we're talking about the so-called Great Purge that happened in Russia after Lenin died. Now, Vladimir Lenin, you may know, is the father of the Russian Bolshevik Soviet Revolution. He promised to overthrow the corrupt monarchy and usher in an age of communist utopia where every man would be a king, they'd all be rich and fat, and everyone would only have to work a few hours a day. From each according to their ability and to each according to their need, as the propaganda went. Of course, some exceptions were made to, the whole share and share alike rule right off the bat. Some animals are more equal than others. Obviously, Lenin and his buddies would need to be able to hold all of the power and have absolute authority for a while until the machinery of the great utopia was set up and running smoothly. Of course, they could be trusted to be good stewards of all of the property of the entire country, and there was no chance of that power corrupting them. After all, they were virtuous academic types, very, very cerebral and dignified. And they could weave a good yarn, and people trusted them. People were like, you know what? These seem like good guys. But anyways, after his own grotesque reign of terror and oppression, Lenin eventually dies, and he leaves behind a succession crisis. And eventually, the most brutal mass murderer and sociopath in human history, Joseph Stalin, declares himself dictator, and he goes around consolidating his power. Now, since it was a communist utopia, everybody was equal before the law, of course. But again, Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, were just a little bit more equal than everybody else. And so they were sent on a mission to discover traitors and spies who were trying to bring down the glorious utopia from within. And as crazy as it may seem, just like a crazy, total random coincidence, it turns out that everybody who has ever disagreed with Stalin or been critical of him in any way was actually a traitor and a spy trying to destroy the communist utopia, if you guys can believe that. In fact, they even confessed, or at least the brutalized, tortured husks of the men and women they had once been confessed. Anyways, a quick purge of 750,000 people slaughtered one gunshot to the back of the head at a time, and another million or so sent off to be worked to death in a Siberian gulag. And boom, after that, it was a perfectly peaceful and wonderful communist utopia that would have totally worked if it weren't for all of the evil capitalists in the West with their McDonald's and their due process and their, business suits. And sadly, because of these, capitalist swine, the utopia was not meant to last. And after the fall of the beautiful paradise, the greedy capitalists came in and tried to make Stalin look bad for his systematic slaughter of dissidents, peasants, ethnic minorities, artists, scientists, intellectuals, and writers, as well as the enslavement of an entire continent's worth of human beings in unimaginable deprivation and brutality. Honestly, if we're fair, this has only happened to 100% of nations who have engaged in collectivist political schemes. And so there's no reason to suspect that it would happen again if we were to try it. After all, Real communism has never been tried, and we are far more virtuous and far smarter and far less prone to corruption than all of those lesser peoples who have tried it. Right? This has been the History Corner. Let's move over to the Random Corner. Oh, man. You guys are probably getting tired of me preaching to you about communism. It's one of those things that's kind of a bugaboo for me personally, because I've met so many people who genuinely think it would be a good idea. And if you even take just a cursory glance at any amount of history, you know, hey, maybe we should think really hard before we try anything that even looks like this, right? A lot of dead people. Anyways, I want to stop. I'm going to take a detour. I'm going to pump the brakes on communism for a little while. And today I want to talk about something that I actually think is pretty cool about Vladimir Putin. His propaganda photos. If you look up Putin propaganda pictures, you will be treated to a magnificent, wonderful sight. You'll see an admittedly physically impressive Vladimir Putin do all manner of perfectly candid, shirtless activities. He does some shirtless horseback riding, some shirtless fishing, a lot of shirtless fishing, actually. Sometimes he's holding the fishing pole. Sometimes he's holding a fish, but he's shirtless in all of them. He does some shirtless sitting in a chair, some shirtless hanging out with dolphins, some shirtless submarining, some shirtless swimming. Obviously, got to be shirtless for swimming. But like a lot of pictures of him shirtless swimming, and some other interesting shirtless activities. The swole dictator has actually done very well to cultivate a super macho air. And I gotta say, I dig his style. In fact, I kind of wish we would take a page out of his book with our own leadership. When are we going to see pictures of shirtless Joe Biden riding a horse, fishing, and hanging out with dolphins? There's nothing at all undignified about doing a presidential calendar shoot. And I think it would go a long way towards boosting national morale. Bring me shirtless Joe Biden pics, please. If Putin can do it, then so can we. This is the new space race, and I feel like we are decades behind in the sexy president race. We choose to shoot sexy shirtless presidential propaganda not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept and we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. That was my lousy JFK impression, and this has been the Random Corner. So let's get back to the main review before I humiliate myself further. Okay, we have reached the portion of the book, or a portion of the podcast, where I talk about things that I didn't like so much about the book. This is where I have to backtrack on some of the things that I have said before, and I got to take a critical look at my own biases. Now, you may have detected at some point during this show some slight prejudice on my part against the system of governance that the Soviets adopted. Keen listeners may also have noticed a small amount of scorn for the rule of law in Russia and for its current ruling class. Here's where I have to come clean and be honest with all of you. I don't know the first thing about Russia. And I have deep suspicions that what I think I know about Russia has been tainted by a lifetime of indoctrination and Western education. Not to mention in all the video games that I've played where the Russians are the bad guys. I would be a fool not to admit that sort of thing. Yes, I think that Putin is probably on balance a bad dude. Corrupt as all get out, and probably a very, very dangerous enemy to have. But, and here's where we have to be fair, the Russian people seem to dig his vibe. In fact, in the last free and fair election that Russia will ever have until Putin is dead, he won over 107% of the vote. That's not fair. Another wisecrack for me about Russia. But let me tell you guys something about Russia that I've become aware of in recent years. Due to the power of technology, I have had the sincere, and I mean sincere, pleasure of being able to follow a number of Russian YouTubers over the years. They do different things, shotgun shooting, building things, outdoor survival stuff. Mostly it's, outdoor type of activities that they're filming. One guy, builds log cabins and does kind of like the rustic survival skills stuff. I dig that. I dig that type of YouTube video, and it's kind of a guilty pleasure of mine. I spend more time than I should on these types of videos. And one thing is absolutely plain as day to me. Russians like Russia. Russians are proud of being Russian. And why not? It's a rich culture with a storied history. And at one point, they were jostling for the top spot in the world. And if we're, honest, they didn't really stand a chance of competing with the U.S. in the long run. Much smaller population, much smaller economy. But boy, did they give America a run for its money. Russian dedication, bravery, industry, innovation, and intensity are the stuff of literal legend. They are known for their love of country and their devotion to their families. Yes, Russians seem to be fairly bleak in some respects, but they are a robust and passionate people as well, hardened by a tough climate and a painful history, and they have a beautiful heritage because of that. Now, through my exposure to these Russians on the internet, I've come to see them as brothers and sisters on the other side of the world who are just trying to live their best lives, do their duty, raise their families, and have as much fun as they can. They also have a wicked, dark sense of humor that has stayed with them even through just the darkest days of their history. I told a couple of jokes earlier that were attributed to Russian sources, but I want to tell another one now that I get a kick out of this every time I hear it. And this is also attributed to Russian sources during kind of the height of the communist Soviet terror. And this is during Lenin's reign, which was it was very horrific. Not as bad as Stalin, but it was not a difference in kind. It was a difference in magnitude. It was still terrible. So this joke, let me just jump into it. So a couple of Russians, they meet up together and they go out and they go and stand in the bread line, where they're waiting to get their daily ration of bread. And it's a huge, long line. It's taking forever. And one Russian says to the other, "This long bread line is not acceptable. We were told that, this would be a utopia and we'd have everything that we needed. And now we're standing in line all day long to get a bit of bread. I have had it up to here. I am going to go and murder Lenin." And so he leaves the line and the other guy stays in the line. Obviously he's, not down for that. And an hour later, the guy comes back, his buddy comes back, joins him in line again. And he says to him, "Oh, how did that go?" And the guy says, "The line was even longer over there." Which, that's awesome, right? And remember, this joke was going around when you might be dragged out of your house in the night and shot for daring to dissent. So the fact that this joke made the rounds is a testament to this bullish bravery and that screw you energy of the Russian people. And I got to say, I have mad respect for that. Now, another thing that I didn't like about this book was its author. And I don't know if I trust the guy. I don't know how credible his account is. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I buy his whole white knight shtick where he's this Western savior of the poor, benighted Russian people. I wouldn't blink if I found out that he was guilty of all manner of things that the Russian government has accused him of. Right? After all, it's not like there's never been a corrupt American fund manager. I mean, you don't have to think too far before you find one of those. So to recap, I didn't love the book's treatment of Russians, and I didn't know how trustworthy the author's account is. But that said, this book was a wild ride, entertaining from start to finish, and definitely worth the time I spent on it. So without further ado, let's get to the rating of the bells. That's right. This is a 4-bell book. Pretty darn good. Not my all-time favorite. Entertaining, really good. I gotta say, I thoroughly enjoyed the narrative and the story that he told, even if it isn't perfectly true, and even if it makes Russians look worse than they probably are. I'd say that this one is worth your time. If you want to pick it up, I would unreservedly recommend it. Take it with a pinch of salt if you have to, but it was so entertaining that it really does climb up in my estimation, even if a portion of it is a work of fiction, right? Now, let's go ahead and head over to the parting thought and wrap up the show. We're running a little bit long as usual. I always seem to kind of ramble on a little bit too long, but first, I wanted to thank you guys again for listening to the show. I really appreciate it, especially if you've made it this far and you're still into it. I apologize if I come off as preachy in this one. I really am just genuinely afraid of, what happens when we end up in a totalitarian regime. When people buy into that sort of thing, those ideas are very, very dangerous, and they can lead to a tremendous quantity of human suffering beyond anything that our own admittedly imperfect system provides, right? Like we have our own problems, and a lot of times people will say, well, who are we to cast stones because we have X problem in our own country. We don't have 100 million people being murdered, right? We don't have 750,000 people shot in the back of the head for disagreeing with the president, right? We don't have 1 million people sent off to slave labor camps in the gulag, for speaking out of turn. We have our own problems, yes, but these are problems that are in magnitude far, 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 far smaller than the problems that you get when you give absolute power to a dictator. Now, that said, once again, I love you guys. I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to share it with someone who you think would get a kick out of it. If you love the show and you want to help support it, financially, head over to my Patreon page, give a couple of bucks to keep me in books. Thank you very much. For those of you who have already done that, it means the world to me. I really appreciate it. If you need to get in touch with me, comments, complaints, corrections, anything like that, you can reach me at whatstomreading@gmail.com. Thank you so much. Let's move on to the parting thought. So for today's parting thought, I wanted to read a little passage written by a man named Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And again, not great with Russian names, but Solzhenitsyn. Anyways, this guy wrote a series of books about the time that he spent in a Russian gulag and other stories that he compiles out of the Russian experience, friends, and things like that during the worst of the communist Soviet days. And this quote is both interesting and I think very worth thinking about. So this is a quote from the Gulag Archipelago series. Quote, at the conclusion of the conference, a tribute to Comrade Stalin was called for. Of course, everyone stood up, just as everyone had leapt to his feet during the conference at every mention of his name. For 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, the stormy applause, rising to an ovation, continued. But palms were getting sore and raised arms were already aching, and the older people were panting from exhaustion. It was becoming insufferably silly, even to those who really adored Stalin. However, who would dare to be the first to stop? After all, NKVD men were standing in the hall applauding and watching to see who would quit first. And in the obscure small hall, unknown to the leader, the applause went on. This is without Stalin even there. Just an introduction. Anyways, back to the quote. 6, 7, 8 minutes. They were done for. Their goose was cooked. They couldn't stop now till they collapsed with heart attacks. At the rear of the hall, which was crowded, they could have, of course, cheat a bit, clap less frequently, less vigorously, not so eagerly. But up there with the presidium where everyone could see them, the director of the local paper factory, an independent and strong-minded man, stood with the presidium. Aware of all the falsity and all the impossibility of the situation, he still kept on applauding. 9 minutes. 10. In anguish, he watched the secretary of the district party committee, but the latter dared not stop. Insanity. To the last man, with make-believe enthusiasm on their faces, looking at each other with faint hope, the district leaders were just going on and on and on, applauding till they fell where they stood, till they were carried out of the hall on stretchers. And even then, those who were left would not falter. Then, after 11 minutes, the director of the paper factory assumed a businesslike expression and sat down in his seat. And oh, a miracle took place. Where had the universal, uninhibited, indescribable enthusiasm gone? To a man, everyone else stopped dead and sat down. They had been saved. The squirrel had been smart enough to jump off his revolving wheel. That, however, was how they discovered who the independent people were, and that was how they went about eliminating them. That same night, the factory director was arrested. They easily passed 10 years on him on the pretext of something quite different. But after he had signed Form 206, the final document of the interrogation, his interrogator reminded him, don't ever be first to stop applauding. That's obviously chilling, right? And you may be asking, what does that have to do with you or I living in the modern Western world, assuming that, most, if not all of you are listening here in the West? Well, I don't think you'd have to do too much stretching. Hopefully you have a good enough imagination to imagine yourself in a situation where you're in a room listening to the preaching of powerful people who are trying to enforce a new age, modern orthodoxy on you. And if we're honest, there is a nouveau militant segment of our own society who are willing to use force and coercion to convert people to their way of thinking. And those who resist this new orthodoxy risk losing their jobs, their reputation, their future prospects. So the stakes are high, right? Admittedly, we aren't to the gulag stage or the shot in the back of the head stage, but give it time, right? Authoritarians need only make a few examples before the general population thinks twice before they cross them. And you may think that I'm being overly cryptic here, and fair dues, maybe I am. But we are living in an era of unprecedented authoritarianism here in the West. Emergencies are being declared left and right so that emergency power can be taken. And if we're honest again, a particular ideology has now dominated academia, the media, and most of the high halls of power in the country, and they do not really like dissent. A lot of people are afraid of ruffling the wrong feathers and losing their livelihoods if they don't pay lip service to the regime. And then this regime of people gaslight people into believing that those who dared to speak up and get destroyed, that these people just simply reap the consequences of their own unrighteous actions, right? And many of those who dare to speak out against the dominant ideology now, they do so from insulated positions, and they stand to gain financially from what they say, right? They're trying to pull their own levers of power. And, while the average Joe, these guys enjoy, immunity, but the average Joe who fails to show adequate deference during a struggle session, he'll be quietly ushered into a room, a struggle session at work here, where I mean, retraining in, correct principles that, modern values that you may have inadvertently committed an ism, or, you're being trained to avoid the ever present dominant isms that you are guilty of by association based off of, your immutable characteristics. And again, sorry if I'm being cryptic here, but these people who fail to show deference, or if they speak up during these struggle sessions, they're quietly ushered away into an HR room and metaphorically shot in the back of the head. They're let go. They're a liability to the company now, and nobody wants to cross these people. They're litigious. They're angry. They're forceful. They pull all the levers of power now. And right now they control pocketbooks more than anything else. And maybe I'm being overdramatic, and I don't want to be, right? I don't want to compare losing your job to being tortured, enslaved, and murdered. But, and I say but here because I want to emphasize this. History has shown that these things tend to be slippery slopes. The people in power never seem to choose to use less force to get their way over time. Right? And if left unopposed and unchecked, it's only a matter of time before even the most well-intentioned ideologies get taken over by the darker side of human nature, and that evil takes the reins again. And we could be living in our own great purge. If you think it couldn't happen to us, then you have to assume that we are somehow inherently, genetically, or in some other way better than the Russians. And as I've said, I don't think that's the case. I think we are just as capable of going down just as bad a path as they did with, their own ideologies back, in the 20th century. And maybe you think I'm crazy or dramatic or blowing things out of proportion. Maybe you're tired of all this preaching about communism, and maybe you're right. Maybe I have gone too far from this. After all, we are a far cry away from anything that the Russians have had to deal with under Stalin. Our systems are robust. Our culture is strong. And what's a little bit of going along in order to build a better society for everyone, right? It's compassionate. Isn't compassion a great virtue? That's a good point. And I'll admit that it's one that I'm still working through myself. But do yourself a favor today. Just like me, I'm going to do the same thing. But do yourself a favor and ask yourself this one question. Are your hands feeling a little bit tired and sore from all of the clapping yet? What happens if you're the first to stop clapping? I know. But still, think about it. That's it for today. Have an excellent day. You guys deserve it. All the best.